The conference will be in Portuguese with simultaneous translation to English and Spanish. To choose a language, just click on the link located in the window close to you. After the conference, we'll return with the presence of Professor Paes de Sousa to carry out the debate with the audience present here, representatives of the Ministry of Health and Social Development of the member countries of UNASUR, and with the participants that are here in Internet. Send your questions and comments through the email communication@isags.unasur.org and at isag.com isags UNASUR. That's the second time that ISAGS shows this important topics with online transmission. This tool is strengthening the Institute interchange and the critical thoughts and the interchange of knowledge and innovations and policies and governance and health. We would like to thank to all the people and organizations that supported us in promoting this conference, the General Secretary of UNASUR, the pro tempore Presidents of Peru, the Ministry of Health of Brazil, from Uruguay, Ministry of Health of Uruguay, from the PAHO, and Gelames from Peru, among others. Even though it's a young institution that will complete 2 years of existence in next July, ISAGS has carried out his basic points: development of leadership and technical consultancy. During the short life, we have carried out several workshops regarding the health in South America, and now we are finishing one more that would deal in surveillance and health in South America. This conference will help for some debates that we'll carry out in the 8th World Conference that will be carried out in Helsinki this year, where they will analyze proposals to promote health in all policies as topics of the 66th meeting assembly that will be done in Geneva. This event is part of the construction of the development agenda post-2012. The objective of this workshop is to promote the reflection, thoughts, etc., on the social determinants and the models of development. So to analyze in depth health and development and social development. Because of his experience in acting in the different areas of health and social development, we would like to invite, and we have the honor of receiving Dr. Paes de Sousa. He's a specialist in evaluating public policies and social medicine by the University of Minas Gerais, and doctorship and the PhD from the University of London. He is a teacher and professor in criminology and public health in Brazil or in other countries like the United Kingdom, South Africa, etc. Was executive officer during the second mandate of President Lula and executive assistant in the Ministry of Health. And now he's in Rio+, together with the program of the United Nations for Development, to help the interchange of knowledge and promote the international debate on development, sustainable development. I'd like to invite Dr. Rômulo to start his presentation. Good morning to all of you. I'm here in this house for the first time, ISAGS. I'm finding friends like Minister Temporon, that, as he mentioned, we had the honor of working together in the ministry of Mr. Lula. And today is the first day of the operation of the center. Rio+ is our first activity of the center, bringing you some type of thoughts regarding the social protection policies for this debate. You can observe that we like to deal with the social determinants from the public policies point of view. And during many years we debated the idea of turning the theoretic framework to the impact on health of the social determinants and policies. I would like to bring to you a new reflection that happened in South America and in part of Central America also. The changes in the social protection policies. I'm going to do this. It's an next presentation. I'm going to do this starting in an economic debate. How the government have invested in these policies of social protection. And after that, I'm going to deal with the limitations of this type of policies. It's interesting what's happening. What's happening today in our days. This week in Brazil, for example, we're carrying out 10 years of the Bolsa Família, that is a very well-known program of social protection and transfer of income. We are working in this Bolsa Família. Together with the transfer of this conditioned income, where they increase the responsibility regarding education and health of children and women. In the case of the health of the pregnant woman and those who are breastfeeding. This program have a very strong presence in Latin America and in the world. And in the world, nearly 66 countries. Why this policy of social protection, specifically in social assistance, such of importance? See what happened in Brazil and the other countries in South America. They have a certain parallel. The health and education itself, a basic learning, started first. In the case of Brazil, health as a model, as a systemic model, and universal model started before the basic learning. In other countries, the history is different. In Uruguay, education started first. But in Brazil, in particular, we had the consolidation first of a universal health system, and after that, the universal attention to the basic education. And after that, we had the presence of mass investments in the public sectors in social assistance, and transferring this income was that program of first entry that had the capability of reaching a large amount of families, vulnerable families. So it differs with the presence of health and education, but who start first. But nevertheless, that is a recent phenomena, the increase in investment of the state in social assistance. I'm going to give you some figures. Please help me to change the slides. You can see that the first thing that you're able to see, we see the recent data of Latin America. And this is important because we see the last 15 years is a continent that showed more expressive results in terms of the reduction of poverty and inequality. And if you're able to observe this graph of the World Bank that shows exactly the following. Here you have a decrease in the amount of poverty and an increase, a growth of an intermediate situation that is not a condition of poverty, but that's a reduction of poverty in general terms. It's a fact that poverty has dropped in Latin America, and it dropped recently. That's a fact. Obviously, many factors. This graph, that is the famous study of the World Bank of Francisco Ferreira, tries to show, in reality, what are the situations what were the factors present in the countries in Latin America that had more incidence in the lowering poverty and extreme poverty. In this income transfer that you're going to see a constant in all of these countries, showing a consistency between the increase of the investment in this type of programs and a reduction, important reduction expressive reduction in poverty, while related to other policies, more conventional ones, like retirements and pensions, etc., is the increase in the minimum wages regarding all the countries, the behavior is different. Something that's common to all countries and show a consistency in these programs is this transfer of income. And why this? Because obviously, in the case of this income transfer, focus in poor populations, what you're able to observe is that this type of investment it's more effective getting the population that's a target of this program. Regarding the other intervention, this type of result could be mitigated because it depends on the results of the organizations that are involved in the formal market. We know that the poor, extreme poor population, it's a contrary. They are not present in the formal market, and those extremely poor, it's really none, practically. For example, the creation of this policies are different. For example, in the case of Brazil, I use the Brazilian example, but a good part of the policies that we compared with the last year. This is not exclusive from Brazil. Brazil, it's very hypothetical. Policies focused on population, extremely poor populations, have a tremendous impact in the income of those populations because they try this group of population that are more vulnerable. And this type of mobilization that we're being able to see here in Brazil, with having been discussing with sociologists the growth of the middle class in Brazil. This data, you're able to see that this reduction of this poor parcel of the population and increase in this segment here, that is what they call the new middle class. Obviously, from the sociological point of view, we use texts that dealt with this middle class in the 70s and 60s and 70s. That's really, there are not too many elements of identity of this that are cut from the point of view of their income. But nevertheless, you're able to see from this point of view the creation of the medium income experienced by this population. That increases based in the case of Brazil, were the largest segment of the Brazilian population, is what the people call the increase in C class, that it's the largest segment, economical segment of Brazil. Obviously, all effort of searching a correlation of this type of growth and the type of policies, for example, there's going to be in the text of this type of debate in this year and next year, because it's an electoral year. A lot of debates going to be carried out about that. But the recent policies, the transfer of income, for example, have increased the floor of income of the country. And this floor of income grew in this country and Latin America nearly all, and also strongly in South America. What are the determinants that are linked to this growth? Obviously, I spoke, one of them is the transfer of income. I'm going to go back in a few minutes. The drop of poverty in Brazil, it's quite expressive. You are able to see in this chart in 2014, the government decided to eradicate extreme poverty in Brazil until 2014. In the Brazilian case, we're talking about extreme poverty, classifying it as $2.5 a day. In Rio de Janeiro, that's going to be reached this year, for example. It's a different situation in different parts of the country. But The way of obtaining this type of elimination of extreme poverty depends on the social protection policies. They're not going to be only to work, but they're going to also come through the social protection. And Europe is the same thing. If you eliminate the benefits that they have in England, you're going to see the size of poverty in England. If you eliminate the benefits in Norway, the several benefits that they have, that public policies in Norway work with, and you're going to see the size of the growth of poverty in these countries like Norway that has an index, one of the best in the world. An important determinant of poverty was the increase of the formal work and labor. Brazil, as Latin America as a whole, the growth in the countries in Latin America grew spectacularly, like Peru, and has rates of growth that are consistent with the Asian rates of growth. They started requiring labor force in an expressive way, and this generated an interesting phenomenon. I'm going to show you what's happening in Brazil. Brazil recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had a change in legislation regarding domestic labor. That means the maids, etc., that work at home. The development of a consistent model to create an equal model between the labor rights of the different workers in Brazil. This is interesting in the Brazilian case because part of the media in Brazil has worked this as something that it's negative for the great part of the population, but they depend of this domestic workers that they have at home. But it's not only a Brazilian phenomenon. In reality, this is a process, a consistent process that goes together with the growth of the need of labor in the formal market. If I take out the people from homes, the emancipation of women, etc., for example, the emancipation of a market, so this is consistent with the expectations of the entry of new labor force in the Brazilian labor market. And in Brazil, that growth is so big that the low qualification worker or the high qualification worker are going to find jobs. We're going to find a reasonable situation of what's being done, but there is a struggle for rights, and the opportunity of this happening now is consistent with the economical expansion of Brazil. Even though it's growing very slowly in the last year, you're able to see in the graph below, here we have the high demand of the labor force, as I said, of engineers to workers in the civil construction area. We see the unemployment dropping. We have 5.5 approximately at the present moment, and this it's a high level of employment in the population. There are all the determinants in this area of reduction of poverty in Brazil and the countries in Latin America, especially in South America. That is the income, the growth of the salaries. That's important that wages have grown, and these are indicators of the Ministry of Economics of Brazil, the exceptional growth of the minimum wage in Brazil. Former President Lula in Brazil said that if something that the medals that he carries on his chest is that the growth above inflation of the minimum wage. And this especially is interesting because the increase in income in the basic levels of Brazil has a very important impact in social protection. Because in Brazilian case, for example, of the amount of political policies that we have. This salary has helped that elderly person that is poor be able to have attention, and they receive an amount of money every month, minimum wage, and when this is changed or increased, they receive that increase also. Note a very important thing, that also minimum wage also guides the labor market from many parts of Brazil. Obviously, it's different in the case of an engineer, that the entry wage is different of a minimum wage, of course. It's more close to 900 reais. But in other states in the north, northeast, the minimum wage is what is paying the massive amount of workers. So with the increase in minimum wage increases the conditions, material conditions, of a great part of the Brazilian population. Remember the following. When we're talking about extremely poor population, we're talking about other things. Extremely poor and distant from the formal working or labor market. See, here is a case of transfer of income in the case of the Bolsa Familia that had an exceptional growth. And I'm going to go back to this data, compare with other countries of Latin America. This graph, it's important because what happened in the world that reduced poverty not necessarily reduces inequality. Why? This, because of the following reason. When you improve the conditions to increase the income of the population, who is ahead goes further ahead. They are in better position and advantage position that take advantage of the possibilities of this increase. In the Brazilian case, there was a very interesting situation, not only the Brazilian case, where there was an increase in a different way of the poor segments of the population. When you see the deciles of lower income in Brazil had a large growth compared with those who are in the higher decile. And the expression that we use in Brazil, long time ago, that the poor had a Chinese growth and the richer one a German growth in terms of the increase in income. It was a combination of factors. It was not true. This was a result of a policy that took some group of population to make more money and some less money. If we have a factor of macro and microeconomic factors, this is the recent year's photograph. And this was a reduction of the distances between those who had higher incomes and those who had a lower income. Another important issue that happened, and I said the importance of the universalization of basic learning in Brazil, the increase of the school years of the workers in Brazil. This is the offer of services, educational services. Mainly in education, basic education, we had 97% of our children in Brazil between 7 and 14 years are in schools. Those poor children experience a difference of 3 years regarding all those classes. There was an important growth in the second level, the secondary teaching in Brazil, a very important growth, and also an increase in offer of mechanisms of access to the universities in Brazil from the end of the 90s up to now. They're not very organized growth, they're very weak, let's say. It's a situation, for example, in the case of Brazil, the policies are a little confusing, but there was an increase in access. And this increase in access combined with a sophisticated market that started requiring a level of knowledge, a higher level of knowledge. It's generating a very simple situation in Rio de Janeiro. The mayor of Rio or the municipality is not opening any tender to bid with people that has a lower level than a certain amount. And even you have less qualification, this type of activity, the level of minimum qualification, it's the second degree or high school. The Ministry Temporal, we had a discussion. We could help any worker that entered the Ministry of Social Development. They should have at least a university level. Any activity, any order, they had a concern that if they had a call for workers, and they needed, let's say, the high school, and they had university candidates. And this generated conflicts between the abilities already developed and the needs of the labor ministry. So that generated a conflict. And what's happening in reality is an offering of a level with a higher level of qualification, and that should readequate the situation. In this situation, the offer also produces alterations in public policies. Many of these countries had experienced in South America the same type of situation, but in an unequal way in a regional level. If we take, for example, the capitals of the countries of the South American countries, this type of situation is already there. In some countries, they have lived this many years ago. Argentina, Uruguay, that lived this situation of a high level of degree of schools, and they have similar situations at the present moment. And now we're passing through very intensive school levels. The case of the Colombian cities, for example. These situations are in the middle of a process. The South American cases, we had transitions, very important transitions. I'm going to talk on that point in a minute. And this is linked to the human transition also. So we have other factors that have contributed to reduce poverty in Brazil. The transfer of incomes, the increase of formal labor, the increase of minimum wage, a group of regional policies, and a very important component in the Brazilian case, the redistribution of the population in Brazil. In the 60s, Brazil was a strongly rural country. Now it's a strongly urban country. But there's a transition
de urbanização, digamos assim, da América do
Sul, turning urban in South America is experienced by all countries. There is a strong movement towards cities, the great cities, and then medium cities, and then a movement or migration towards cities that happened in Brazil, but not only in Brazil. And now, with this type of economic growth of the country of South America, we're going to experience all the changes in the situation of the great cities. That is the presence of the migrant worker. In the case of Brazil, strongly, in the city of São Paulo, for example, there are 350,000 Bolivian workers or citizens from Bolivia in the city of São Paulo. But there are only 14,000 registered. And this is not only going to happen in Brazil, it's going to happen with the more dynamic centers in South America. Expect the same thing in Peru, in Uruguay, in Chile, of course, not in Colombia. Not in Colombia, why not? Because the need of the more dynamic centers of to import, to qualify labor, to have opportunities and have an access of offering of qualified labor in the world because of the crisis. If we watch this policies of social protection, we're going to find at the beginning of the decade, of the 2000 decade, we're going to find, specifically, I'm going to use some slides of the study that's going to be published by the Asian Bank. We compare this country, Brazil, Colombia, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, and Peru. The idea was to use countries, big size, Brazil and Mexico, medium-sized countries, Colombia, Peru, and smaller countries, Jamaica and Honduras. And what is interesting to observe, in reality, we have an extremely poor population, and we have to justify a stronger intervention in terms of protection policies. We're going to find that in the Colombian case and Brazilian case. In Honduras, there is an expressive amount of population, the more favorable situations in Jamaica. In the case of Mexico, similar to Brazil and Peru also. To give you a general idea, the process of school level, and we have populations with levels of low learning levels compared with OECD, and we have a lower level of mortality. In many of these countries are higher and others low, and that justified a type of intervention that could be directed to that poor population, extremely poor population, so to reduce that deficit in the living conditions, and also be able to improve the general situation of this country. Before getting into this new slide, what we are dealing on social protection policies, there are two great matrices, theotic matrices. One is the right that the population, the vulnerable population, have rights to have access to public policies to obtain protection in their unfavorable situation. And also the development of human capital. We have to improve the conditions of life of our workers, to improve their conditions, working conditions, and turn the country more competitive in a more integrated and global economy. So, this two matrices and the discourse of the different governments that deal with this. What is curious is the two matrices are interlinked or intertwined or interchange in English. But anyway, they are, yes, interlinked. And what we're able to observe, it's alternative use of the discourse. And why? Because the political audiences, internals of each country, understand better one or another discourse. When we're talking about this these policies are not universal, but they're directed to certain part of the population. The understanding of the right, it's more understood by the population that is closer to this. The development of human capital, generating wealth, and the collective population that favors who is able to accumulate more, it's known by other part of the population. What we observe are the alternative issues, and I talk with different political leaders of different countries who carry out the studies, and many of them really get angry when we talk this point. And these borders are less clear that it could look like. But we're in the middle of an era of social democracy where the debate was more clear and the borders were more clear. Today, this is not as clear as it was
Aí,
some years ago.
nós temos que observar o seguinte: se as necessidades estão dadas
Here,
por essa,
we have to observe the following. If the needs are given by
as
this
oportunidades,
type of
os
indicators,
meios, as capacidades que os países
opportunities
dispõem de responder
and means, the capability of the countries have to give an answer to this demand are obviously
do tamanho da sua população,
in the capability of investment, considering the size of the
arrecadação que o
population,
país dispõe, ou seja, o quanto o
the
país pode
income that the
arrecadar,
country
na
has,
verdade,
how
em
much
relação
the country is able
aos seus mecanismos
to
como impostos, por exemplo, e
receive
aquilo
and
que o
taxes,
país já
for
contraiu em
example,
termos de dívidas,
and that the country
obviamente,
has
o que ele obtém,
included in debts,
considerando
or
a
received in
diferença
debts,
entre o que ele pode
considering
arrecadar e
the
o que ele
difference
precisa pagar,
between
ou seja, compromissos a serem
what is
pagos.
able to obtain and what he has to pay, the commitments they have
Em muitos casos, o
with
país
the foreign
tem
debt.
já uma
It's
capacidade
interesting this because sometimes the country has a capability of
esse caso, por exemplo,
investment,
Jamaica é sempre
a very considerable
diferente em
one.
muitos aspectos.
The case of Jamaica, for example, is surprising in many aspects. We had
Isso vai se alterar quando
this,
começar logo em seguida. De
and
qualquer forma,
this is going to change in the following slide.
em termos dessa capacidade
We
de
have
investimento, nos
starting
países
different
por
starting
exemplo,
points
no Brasil,
regarding this
em
investment
relação a
capability.
Honduras, etc.
Regarding Brazil, for example, compared with Honduras, etc.
A despeito disso, a capacidade de investimento
Apart from
dos
this,
países é mais ou menos semelhante.
The capability of investment of the countries is similar.
Os países investem em termos de
One
transferência de
curious
renda, por
issue,
exemplo, cerca de
the countries
0,3,
invest in
0,4%
income transfer
do seu PIB.
0.3, 0.4% of the GDP,
Isso vocês podem ver pelo tamanho, na verdade,
and
desses círculos aqui.
that can be seen
Com exceção do caso do
in the
Peru,
size of the
onde o
circles over
investimento
here,
em transferências condicionadas de
except
renda
the
é
case of
menor,
Peru, where the level of
e, por conseguinte,
transferred of income is lower,
os
and
demais
we have
países
a population covered, a lower amount of population covered.
Brasil e México,
The other countries make
nós,
similar investments.
Jamaica,
Brazil, Mexico are close, Jamaica, Honduras, etc.
de que os governos
As
estão
it
dispostos
was
a investir
a limit
nas suas políticas de combate ao
that what the governments are able to invest in these policies to fight poverty.
capacidade de
And it's
investimento,
curious because we're talking about different starting points. We're talking about investment, different policies, the nature of the other public policies of those countries, the situation of Brazil in terms of health policies and coverage of basic attention services. None of these countries are close to this. They have a deficit in this coverage.
São situações muito distintas. Já na parte educacional,
So,
ela é mais
there are different situations. In the educational area, they are very close in the different areas. So we're going to have different starting point, different budgets, sizes of population that are different, and a certain volume of investment more or less similar. And this was some new findings. I'm going to explain you what. That's one of the questions that are part of a study.
Então vejam o que aconteceu na verdade com os
Well,
investimentos, por exemplo,
see what happened in reality with the investments
que é o exemplo que eu estou
in these income transfer,
Nós
condition
partimos de uma
income
situação, no caso
transfer.
brasileiro, por exemplo, de um investimento
We
de
started
0,27,
from a Brazilian case, a 0.27 investment, and we reached 0.36 of investment. If we take the situation of Colombia, it was 0.07 to 0.23.
que ela é mais consistente, ela começa com 0,3,
The situation of Mexico,
0,43.
this more consistent, starts at 0.3, 0.43.
Geral, os países começaram com
What's this showing us? That in generally the country started with lower investment. Brazil didn't start it in 2004, started in 2001.
nós teríamos, obviamente, número bem menor que esse.
From 2001 on, we should have a lower number than this. This is the unification of 4 existing programs that resulted as this Bolsa Familia program. The countries keep growing, and they reach a closer point of 0.40. See the situation in the whole world. The largest investment was 0.6, and from there on, there is a certain situation of stabilization in the situation, and the growth, it's according to the fiscal situation of the country, is able to obtain more money and for the GDP, the larger investment. But their investment are long-term investments. The countries that start doing this investment should be ready to invest for a long period of time. I have seen different discourses, and you probably have seen them also, and I was present at many of the government ads suggesting the end of investments or a reduction of these investments of a medium term. It didn't happen. These investments are frustrating, growing in long term. If you have the opportunity of seeing something that was published yesterday on the O Globo paper, talking about the Bolsa Familia program, that is now 10 years old, there is a study in O Globo that indicates that 45% of those who receive 10 years ago in 2003, they're still receiving that subvention. But for a very clear reason, the matter explains that, or those who know how to read are going to be able to understand what is written over there. In extremely poor areas that are economically low, the possibility of entering in the labor market for this work is very limited. There's the fact that this income transfer is part of the different municipalities, and that's in certain municipalities is the most important flow of income that they have.
Retirement, Bolsa Familia, and BVC. The money that circulates in the city comes from these sources. So these kind of places, it's not the income transfers will solve the economics of the municipalities. We need other policies and other circumstances, and Brazilian economy is based on some activities, for example, commodity exportation and service market, and this is concentrated in urban places. So I'm not surprised if this really is a fact, but we have to really consult other studies in order to have consistency in the information, but itself doesn't impress me. Because, in fact, once we establish a social protection policy and it has a great impact on poverty of the poor people, and this implies an increase in the average income of the population as a whole, this does not solve the microeconomics problems. It will help to have an immediate impact and will be absorbed during time. So, we have a situation where we will continue having poverty. We will continue having a situation what responds to the income of this population is a mix of an income coming from social protection and income coming from work, and many times from a sub-employment. What has explained the increase of this investment in social protection, especially in transfers, is linked to the increase of coverage. This increase of coverage was from 20.8 to 26.9. Not regarding population, it's about 50 million of people that are being benefited in Brazil. Obviously, we will consider other countries. For example, Colombia, we start with 3.8, we will reach 25.3, and in Jamaica, 15.8 will reach 30.6, although the population is very small, and in Mexico goes from 20 to 24, and in Peru that has a very lower coverage, as I had mentioned. Something also that is important that I can explain this growth of investment in social assistance, I would say that we have 4 important reasons. The first one is we had fiscal space. The governments were able to invest. This is linked to economical growth. And in second place, a political pressure. If population have an enrichment of the country, the question is, will we participate in this growth and enrichment in some way? And in low economical dynamism, how can we participate? So we have to respond to this kind of demand. Is it feasible? Because it has been a bureaucracy to work with these systems regarding health and basic education. This platform and articulation of service is very important to a bureaucracy. In Brazil, for example, currently we have 250,000 workers working in social assistance. This is a very low number. But it means that the state is developing a labor market. They're not all social assistants. Only 50,000 are social assistants. The other 200,000 are other procedures. But nevertheless, they are linked to this kind of market. This is productive change of social assistance in Brazil. And this also occurs in other countries. Other countries start working their networks of service and social assistance as the requirements of income transfers. Chile, for example, is very developed, very, very developed. But other countries start developing now with a lot of emphasis. So this explains how these things have appeared. Another important issue is average number of the transferences. The transfers then started to grow in this average number, in part because there was a rationality of this intervention. It was they were enabled to make an allocation of this same program in Brazil, but also due to readjustment processes that were consistent with the inflation. And an essential component in economical growth is inflation. When we think about Peru, we talk about the GDP in Peru, but let's look at the inflation as well. In Lima, for example, or inflation in Rio de Janeiro, in the case of Brazil. I arrived to live in Rio yesterday and was frightened with the prices here, and my references are from Brasilia, and it's not cheap to live there. So these are issues that are very important. There was an increase in coverage and an increase of the average amount that is being transferred. In the case of investment in health, in the case of Brazil, I would like to make a comparison of these two policies, comparing also with education. In the case of Brazil, for example, this is a study that Jorge Abrão from EPE made on investments. Did you also participate, Roberto? No. You can observe here an investment in health. And it's constant regarding GDP. But we look at the nominal investment, it grows in a great speed. Someone could observe and say, do you know which is a problem? We're investing little in health. Well, this is really an issue, but we also have to consider that policies that have expansion level in a great way, in a specific moment, they are blocked, they are limited. This is valid for everything. Also for income transfers, as I tried to show previously. So in health, this happened. In fact, the growth in health in terms of investment is essentially nominal. The second issue is public investment. When we observe social assistance, you can see an exceptional curve here. And we won't find the same thing in education, although we will find a recent inclination. But this is very linked to a second-degree expansion, and third-degree expansion and investment was also important. But here, no. Here we have a curve of accelerated growth. And this point here, in some specific moment, we'll find its platform here, a certain limitation in its investment capacity. What indicates, therefore, maybe this can be explained, these three curves, different curves in Brazilian case, by the maturity times of these public policies in health, education, and social assistance. These are different times, and if we observe the curves and want to compare the curves, we have to be honest and also compare the correct periods. If not, we will compare a period of a mature or hypermature period, like health, for example, and a system that is mature, that is a case of basic education in Brazil, with a very immature and young system that is a social system in Brazil, where Brazil and South America have arrived very late at this social expansion. As we arrived late in health and in education in the great part of the country, we have arrived very late in social assistance. I didn't leave this in blank on purpose. I wanted to write in Spanish and in English. Now I'll speak to you. These are 5 issues. We were trying. I was confused because the slides were in English. I decided to keep this in English. The 5 challenges are the following. The fact of having an investment in social protection in an accelerated and recent way, and it will be in a long term, because great policies are not always observed. I am convinced, I don't know what Temporal thinks about this, but very extended policies don't disappear. They change the name and they grow. This is my understanding regarding these policies. I was talking with Central America countries worried with elections. I told them, at the most, they will change their names and they will grow, but they will not disappear, even because great transformations in public policies depend on historical factors, the end of a dictatorship or military dictatorship, the appearance of a new political class, a revolution, and so on. Historical expressive changes or economical changes, social changes that will allow the public policy is not rearranged by the will of a new party that wins the elections. You need social, historical, specific conditions in order to be legitimate to make great, important transformations. That means it's not the change in the power that would allow transformations that are of importance. Thank God it's like this, because it really compels more consistency when you make changes. The first issue that will appear is the following. A challenge on the effective socio-economic inclusion of families that are the target of this intervention, and this is a great challenge. And this week we're starting a new seminar dealing with a Brazilian seminar. World Bank made a study regarding this, and they considered these conceptual models and included production also. This is a great challenge. This is linked to a set of variables that make the people are enabled to insert themselves in a labor activity and have a sufficient income to survive correctly. And there are a set of phenomena beyond the social determinants. And these situations are anything is regarding poverty, the poor people. I was in a debate in Stanford once, and a person made a question: what does social protection make to guarantee the improvement in education? I said, sending more people to school. Social protection is only allowed to do this. Who guarantees improvement in the quality of education and health are the institutions or a set of institutions. So they don't cancel the existence of policy in education or health. They only increase the demand. So doing this, increasing the demand, obviously they come near to the issue of quality. That is, the quality in service rendering. And then we have an important issue. This is the first issue, is productive inclusion. The second issue is the integration of policies, being of education, health, or social assistance. The third issue will be the quality of the service rendered, including the social assistance, not only in health.
Here, obviously, the demands of financing of these policies, like I showed to you, we have a trend to the stabilization of investment in health and education. But we're now increasing the demand for such services. The question is, do these systems require bigger budget? In certain countries, certainly, because they have poor coverage. Certain countries in Central America, you know well, the tax revenue is 13% of every taxpayer, which is very little, because obviously there are limitations. Brazil have a high tax collection. Some people say that it's beyond what would be healthy, let's say. We consider these amounts as poor, but it limits the capacity of investment of the state. On the other hand, if we work in an integrated way, it's important that all these policies lead to integration. There is a positive example in Mexico. Of course, there is a struggle between different sectors, but still there are political instances that allow for a better articulation. Brazil has been doing attempts on this line, but where I saw this in a more elaborate way, it's in Mexico, in Argentina also. Integration of social policies, formal policies, and therefore with a higher capacity of understanding regarding the matter. A last component of these challenges has to do with the following. Our public policies package is rather limited. We managed to tackle a part of the problems. If we were to think about the demands of the populations, they are enormous. They are demands which are intensive for public policies. When we look at these budgets, someone can say, listen, we're investing too much in this direction. Honestly, 0.4% of the GDP is very little money. What we have is an enormous deficit of public policies. So if you could read, I would say that we have a certain framework to try to show the following. What's the sort of policies we would need in order to respond to different demands of, for instance, grown-up women. Why am I trying to work with adult women? For the following reason. Social protection policies in Latin America, they are mostly focused on the children. And this is more obvious with children. Why? Because children is the most vulnerable, less protected segment in the policies. Many policies in other countries focused on the elderly. In any case, the elderly, they had access to protection policies and not the children. So the revenue transfers focus on the children rather, and they present an alternative in the case of the girls. But for the adult women, there is an overload of responsibility, as if the state was spilling over its responsibility. They are, like they say, state workers. The state demands from them more regarding education and health of their children. Very well. What could we do in terms of public policies that could present an alternative for adult women? What you see here is, I can't read too well because it was me who wrote it. I think I remember. Those of you who are closer to the screen, feel free to correct me. The first major issue of revenue transfers, when you increase the revenue, there is a broadening of the income base of the family, and which has an important consequence, which is on the purchase of food. Therefore, the improvement of the family diet. If the families have more revenue and they have an expectation of eating better, they can invest more money on better food. We did studies in Brazil about what was the ambitions in terms of food. The poorest people wanted to eat more produce and more meat. But this whole story on healthy food, the whole hype on healthy food, it is noticed, and people begin to have this as ambitions, and they respond correspondingly. So the first issue is linked to that, the possibility of improving their diet, and above all, the families' diet. When there was a dramatic drop in fecundity, the families begin to allocate more money to food in several countries. There was an important drop in natality, so they begin to transfer great part of the income to the children because the family cannot lose those few children they have. So there is a biological survival which has to do with the survival of the children. So this has also a demographic, ideological explanation. I remember when I used to tell this in my ministry, people got upset because they thought there was just the public policies that made people to change their behavior. No, it's when there is a coincidence between the intention of the public policy and the people's intentions. Otherwise, they don't change. The other matter is linked to self-esteem, the fact that people are buyers with more reliability because they can pay at the end of the month, they can plan their budget, their monthly budgets. This is an important issue for the own self-esteem of women who usually are the people who receive these benefits. But there is another important matter here. In Brazil, the transfer is monthly, but only in Brazil. In other countries, this is done every 2 months. In some countries, like Honduras, every 4 months. So this is different. And the fact that this transfer being in a different cycle changes the very use of these resources. In the Brazilian case, this money is used for food because you can't plan a monthly planning of buying food. To do it every 2 months, this is more complicated. In Mexico, for instance, this is done every 2 months. The use of this money is different. In the case of Honduras, there was a complaint from the part of the managers of these programs, and they would ask me, we do the same thing. If you receive your money, your salary, every 4 months, you won't buy all the food you need for 4 months, because you had to build a different strategy to buy your food. You'll use this to buy your television set, and so on, and it's fair, which means the fact of transferring money, the way you do, the cycle of money transfer elicit different responses. Yeah, I am the only one who can read the slides, so this allows me a vast amount of creativity. At least I'm not changing what the author thinks. As the author is myself, I can just be reviewing my concepts. Yeah. So let me press the right button here. What is in the what we see here in the solid line is what we already have in terms of public policies regarding income transfers. They influence, now I'm talking about adult women, not for children. But we have, in the case of health, both regarding pregnancy as well as post-birth. But there is a lack of policies regarding that could increase the women's professional skills for her best position in the labor market, which means all these aspects are not covered by the income transfer policies, because the adult woman is not part of the target public of intervention of such policies. The woman is covered as a whole, as family. Some other countries like Jamaica, she belongs to the bracket of the elderly and the handicapped. But this is different because these countries do not have consistent policies for such groups. Where there is such policies in other countries, obviously, the income transfer focus basically to children. It would be therefore necessary a complementation of public policies which could respond to the demand of these more exposed populations that will have as a consequence an improve on their living standards, which would allow for a better skills to enter the labor market if they so desire. So I try to cover the following issues. First, I try to tell you there has been an important investment of social protection policies. Such policies, they had an important investment on conditioned income transfer. Such conditioned income transfers have to do health and education via their specific conditionalities, and they came to impact upon the demand for health and education. And upon doing so, in certain countries, that implied an increase of investments in health and education, although much smaller investments than the income transfer itself. We do see needs for the improvement of such policies, not only policies external to social assistance, but the policies themselves need to be reshaped so that we could respond to demands of such population. There are limits to such policies because of their lack of integration with other social policies. An important challenge, which is in the economic plan, because although we have a trend of stabilization around the figure of 0.4% of GDP, certain countries have limited investment capacities because of low revenue of the governments. Therefore, we need to proceed on an efficiency policies, and that would be efficient in their enforcement. In South America is a reference for such policies throughout the world. In Latin America, there are 18 programs, 130 million people who benefit such programs of this nature. And the world, especially Asia, is very interested in the Latin American experience. I would close saying that we are in a different time frame. We're no longer in a time frame where public health and the sanitary reforms that several countries went through would show their logical models, their frameworks saying the following: we need different policies. the new policies are coming up. We certainly have integration problems, but they are coming up, they are sprouting, and they have been having positive results. There are enormous challenges in both sides, both health as other policies. Nevertheless, we're talking now on a context not only where one given system demands responsibility from its surroundings, where we're talking intersystemic relationships. Policies have diversified themselves, and obviously this does not happen in an isolated way. It happens on the context of economic growth. They have difficulties, but they continue growing. Therefore, we're in a different palier of public policies, which is much better, because we're talking about a different tire of quality, and a different tire, a tire of improving the responses and to present better solutions, and not in a situation of isolated preaching of public health. So it's no longer a desert, it's the risks of a context where we have a plentiful of public policies. Thank you very much.
Bem, eu queria.
So I would like to thank Dr. Rômulo, his excellent conference, and I'll also thank the participation of all the public present. And those of us who are watching us via internet, I'd like to repeat that you are free to ask questions via those cards for the present people, for those who are present, and for those of us who are following us through internet. You have the address, the Facebook, the email, and Twitter addresses where you can direct your questions. So I'll start myself with asking the questions that have already arrived to my desk. We have at least here an opportunity. We have about an hour free for debate. Dear Romulo, one of the first questions I got here where your contribution can be important deals with the matter of after the Rio+20 conference. The question is, when discussing social determinants of health, we always talk about the global crisis and the models of development, and that such development models are important milestones on the matter of health. How do you see, as there is this model of development, global model, and this world movement placed upon the Rio+20 as one of the post-15 or post-millennium goals, I'd like to ask, what can you comment about this?
Obrigado, Juval. Eu acho que
Thank you. I think this is a very important issue, because Rio+20 already appeared in a context of crisis. We were already going through an important crisis, and it's a crisis which is not easily perceived by the government themselves. To give you an example, before Rio+20, the International Conference of Social Determinants here in Rio, an important debate that took place in that conference was whether we should mention or not the crisis. Some countries thought that the crisis was such short lag phenomena that was not worth to enter into the final declaration of the conference, because the declaration is a long-term consequence. So the very perception of the crisis is an important political debate, because the basis of the elements of the crisis, they go beyond punctual places or systemic factors. Its roots are in the very model of development. The issue of Rio+20 is exactly to formulate those concepts which do not only belong to the triangle environment, society, and economy, which means we're not talking only on a better understanding of these three dimensions. It goes beyond that. In every one of these dimensions, we need to reformulate its foundings upon the logic of investment. So this process of recovery, we know that's a long one. We still do not have an alternate model. There is an ongoing debate on which models within the present model it could present an exit. But the moment is now of still inability of formulation. Let's see what's happening in Europe, and our perplexity has increased. For instance, the expectation regarding political changes that did not take place, as regarding the production of alternatives for the European debate, and more than that, the situation of certain European countries worsened from then onwards. So why do I think that the contribution of the Rio+20 can give is to be this space of thinking where we could place into the debate not only the need for a new model, but to explore in depth the deficiencies of the present model.
Now, this is a work for a lot of people, a lot of countries, and a lot of centers, because it's a complex thing, and obviously has a lot of people against the diagnosis that the crisis is very broad and deep problem. Thank you very much. We have another question that I think is also very important, and we would like to know what you think about it. It's about UNASUR, or the initiative of UNASUR. Besides the geopolitical interests that exist, which would be the peculiarities of UNASUR, of the proposal of UNASUR regarding other previous initiatives from regional blocs? What could be a trait, how to interpret the initiative of UNASUR? Well, when we consider this is always presented as historical, cultural, or economical reasons. They always come together with the two great determinants, or one alternative to the other one. In the case of UNASUR, it was always presented at the beginning as an economical reason, a requirement. As the world was organized in blocks, we should also have a block of countries that as a bloc to work in a competitive way. The fact of the European bloc facing a very great difficult moment, UNASUR has increased its responsibility. It's not only to discuss the building of blocks, because we have different blocks from countries of UNASUR. The issue is to observe that with an integration process that is growing economically, the impacts of the changes in the countries, the greater they are, the continental effects are very huge. So it is necessary to understand how much UNASUR has of historical motivations, political and social ones, beyond the economical dimension. So I believe that the issue of being in a very specific historical context, this increases our responsibility of thinking of the responsibility of these blocks. Now I have a question that comes from the colleagues of the Health Ministry of Peru. And they say that the countries had different geographical, economical, and development differences. And the question is, how does this influence the process of improving the social protection policies? Should they be different? What kind of government level should they be responsible for? They're always different. Each country has specificities where general aspects of a suggested policy, once it is implemented in the country and it becomes a practice, it becomes specific to that country. Why? Because of all these elements that were mentioned in the question. That means the culture, the political arrangements and institutional arrangements are different. The way of executing the policy also and the culture of each country are different. So each policy is unique. The starting points to produce this public policy, they obviously consider the knowledge of the countries, because this follows methodology that is regarding science. Who brings better results? Which are determinants that are attributed to specific results? Do this the whole time. If we're thinking about anything, we will do it this way. However, when it becomes effective, we will have to build something new. Something new. So, in spite of having an effort or having a guideline of political policies in order to have the best practices, the conversion of this into real policy is something different. It's a new adventure, always. Thank you, Rômulo. Another question here. People that are hearing us, how, as a region, can we increase the structuring of health system with universal perspective? Is it possible that countries with small economical development offer universal, integral, and public access? The issue of universalization of health services doesn't have to do with investment, but has to do with the quality of the services. Because the poor countries offer universalization, which is Cuba is a classic example. Costa Rica also is an example with positive results. But what makes the countries not to search for universalization as the same path? It's a desire of the population regarding the service that they want. Although this is based on indicators, rational indicators, apart from this, it exists. Insatisfaction is a fact, and alternatives in the market present themselves, like in Brazil, like in Colombia, and other places. So we must think as follows. Up to what point does a public health service can offer services that contemplate the demands of the population in the response, in the quality of the service rendered, and in the coverage of procedures that the population desires, even if this is not very rational. But you must have a dialogue and a building of a understanding that the society understands. Systems that have function and they will not be continued in the future. They have functioned this way. They had a degree of very low satisfaction with the systems. So what is happening in Europe is very interesting. Europe went through a review of their models. The motivations are old, the demographical transition, investment logics, public policies, and so on. The crisis generated the possibility of performing model adjustments. And some systems, they shrank. But the investment in a general aspect in social protection has increased because these policies generate a reduction in employment and increase in vulnerability. So Greece, for example, increased, Spain increased, Portugal increased, Germany reduced. But Germany has an employment rate of 5.6. So the issue is not the investment. The issue is quality, social perception, and the capacity of dialogue of public power with the population. This brings more alternatives than saying that the investments are not possible. Now I have a question that comes from a Uruguayan delegation, and it concerns the relation that can exist between social protection policies and income transference regarding the maintenance of life quality. Concretely, the question is, when you remove the benefit, when the benefit disappears, do you maintain, for example, the maintenance of families in school, access to health, or does this mean dependency linked to social protection? Well, I would like to start my answer mentioning a Minas Gerais author that says, to live is very risky. To live is very risky. From the point of view of what we know scientifically about income transference and conditioning regarding education, the results are not consistent. What we know that the increase of income transfers with conditioning or not, that means without the compulsory of sending children to school, implies that children have to go to school. That means if the families have an increase in the income, the commitment to send the children to school, being compulsory or not, increases. We know this from studies performed in the whole world, comparing the transfers that are conditioned like the ones in Latin America and the ones that are not conditioned like the African ones. They're not conditioned because they don't have schools to offer a great part of their children. So there's no sense in defining a condition to receive the benefit that the family sends the children to school. There are no schools for the children to go. So this is the first point. So the answer is there is income transfers. It increases the commitment with the family apart from with the conditioning. The results go many ways regarding conditioning transferences. The second point that I understand from your question, the second component of your question, I would say, if we remove the social protection, an important part of the families not only will lose life quality in a general aspect, but also reduce the commitment with their children in several manners. This in the world. It's not only in South America, but it is also in Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden, Germany, any place. If you consider the volume of people that are helped with unemployment salary in the United Kingdom, it's very impressive. So we have to understand that some requirements of social protection, not because poverty is a transitory phenomenon. Poverty or extreme poverty can be suppressed, poverty can be diminished. The problem is that we have different vulnerabilities, and besides, we produce new problems. If we think, considering the experience of Scandinavian countries, we have new poverty, drug dealers or users and immigrants, and recent families with adolescents and so on. I mean, population that are discriminated. For example, the gypsies. So we have situations where populations are in vulnerable situations. They have difficulty in responding to these demands. In some cases, because the population want to become hidden, because they're afraid of the government suppression. So even if you have very good socioeconomic condition and protection, even then we have challenges in terms of political policies. Even Uruguay, that have impressive results and have advanced policies like non-conditioned income policies for elderly people in Montevideo, for example, we have, even so, the requirement of social protection. And if they remove this, the families will suffer. Thank you very much. Another question that is interesting. They request if you can give your comments. What other type of strategies are occurring in South American countries regarding the improvement of social determinants that are not strictly linked to income transference program, if this exists? Yes. First, let me go back to schooling. Schooling is an important strategy. I didn't speak a lot about this because in many countries it was a second or the first wave in terms of consolidation of public policies. But I would like to mention about schooling. Besides countries that already have exceptional levels of schooling like Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, that has advanced a lot in the last 20 years. But the other countries that have invested in educational policies consistently, they have tried to respond to which demands? You have to present, you have to increase schooling, and you have to reduce the differences in. You also have to present qualification to the demands for qualified service. During a long time, if it's something that is a consensus for any ideological matrix that thinks about society or economics, you have to consider education. No one denies that the state is responsible for this. This policy was worked in many places, and something very interesting occurred in the South Pacific. Some islands in the South Pacific had an intense investment in the schooling of their population. It happened that there was no diversification of economic activity in those countries, so the activity continued being tourism and people becoming engineering, physics, and what did these engineers and physics and so on do when they graduated? They started working in tourist agencies, in hotels during what they would do if they hadn't studied. So this brought a lot of frustration to a young population and increased criminality. This is related, and to the increase of fighting among gangs and young people. This is connected to the frustration of qualification out of place. This was very interesting for us to understand that in terms of public policy, we have to know where we're stepping. What are we offering? Where are the desires and the opportunities? If this is not correctly articulated, we will be producing this kind of situations. Obviously, a diver engineer is a very qualified person. You have to agree it is not exactly the expectancy that this engineer had when he graduated. So, we have a new momentum in case of South American policies, and I want to emphasize education focus in specific marketplaces because the opportunities and focus also in growth opportunities in professionally consistent with the economical growth. So I think here we have good experiences to work with.
We have another question that asks you to comment upon the issue of formulation of human resources policies in order to increase the demand of social help. The question is whether this is happening in a more structured way or else it's happening just for the incentive of the growth, whether they are human resources policies more folk-directed. This is an important issue, the issue of the human resources. In health specifically, it's a dramatic issue in health care. Brazil has looked for different ways and will continue looking for different ways. The size of the problem is very big. This issue of sending skilled people to the areas of the country with lowest economic dynamism, that's a big challenge in the case of the healthcare. In Brazilian case is the best consolidated policy, but will also appear in other qualities. In the case of the higher skill level, both in education itself and social assistance. In the case of social work, this intervention is done in two levels. There's one level, there's where the state presents alternatives of training of skills. Some are mandatory because they depend on the operation of certain programs, and others are broader qualification levels where the state increases the qualification of these people when the state has resources for that. The second, more consistent, depends on the dialogues with the what comes from the universities. Not necessarily this is an easy issue. Let me give you an important example. So much so that Rio de Janeiro is one of the important centers of formation of social workers in Brazil. The concept itself of social assistance and its way of working, which is developed based upon this model, starts from the principle where the social worker works in every dimension. It's a person who identifies, interprets the needs of the families and presents. It depends these alternatives of what he has a high level understanding of the process. And then comes a social health system that fragmentates this work, the way the Brazilian health system did. For the doctors, this was less of a trouble because the doctors were already working on a sort of production chain that depended on other professions, so they needed to share their functions. They had, including with other other doctors, this process of developing of protocols, fragmentation of the work process, and therefore production of indicators and so on. So this happened within the health system in a much easier way. But in social works, this is not so easy. This begins with the process of expropriation of that minimum that every professional has upon this process, and the feeling of alienation regarding the final product of its work. This is clearly spoken on a debate with the state. But at this point, the issue of doing a conversion between a public policy and a system, this is a difficult process, and a process that has its shortcomings, and how to and there is the organization of medical work, and this expect from these systems similar as to the health systems. It's a matter of having the Sousa's references as good and as bad, because when you translate this into other areas, this will generate a conflict with the other schools, which more recently became to work with the system itself. So let me warn you, the School of Social Work developing in Brazil is different from most South American countries. It has a different philosophy. In other countries, this was not a problem. It had more to do with the logic of work organization as it was perceived in these countries. We have here another question, which is from Suriname, which refers to this example you mentioned about policies of increasing protection of the adult woman. Which are the alternatives? What's the best way to measure the success of a program of this nature, whether measuring the increase of coverage or else measuring the increase of the number of families that migrated away from the bracket of poverty? I understand this question in two levels. First is the issue of the woman specifically. I think that the problems must have three components. First, one has to recognize the woman as a target public. This only happens in Mexico. It's difficult to conceive, to design the policies or certain aspects of the programs that would respond to such programs. The second issue that's very important is that there should be components focused exclusively to women. This shows in Colombia, but this showed in an explicit and a broad way, a diversity of actions. This is linked to a matter of self-esteem, of skills to the labor, and there is the matter of the nursery, of course, because it's a central issue. The difficulty of women face is the problem of the time allocation in their day. If they do not have time to get better skills because their domestic chores prevent them from, they cannot allocate time to take care of themselves or improve their situation. It's important to have strategies that would allow for them to allocate time for their improvement of skills. So the nursery for their children is essential component in this action. Second matter is how to work a success indicator through coverage or through quality. Quality in investments. This is the $1 million answer. Actually, this is the question. It depends. The situation of every country. The coverage goal is a goal that's formulated in most countries in the beginning of a tenure, of a term. It's more easily noticed than the effectiveness of the investment, which is far more abstract. This choice is usually it takes place in the middle of the tenure, in the middle of a mandate. They say, well, this depends on the amount, on the capacity of previous investment in the country. In the case of the Brazilian program Bolsa Família, there was already a certain platform, a municipal bureaucracy that was already set up working with social policies, because what the countries sometimes do not think, it's not only a matter of direct budget allocation. They need to see which are the institutional setups which allow for a certain policy to be enforced. If there is not a previous investment, both in education and that would allow to create a municipal bureaucracy, you have to start from scratch, as it happens in many African countries. In this case, it's more difficult to have a coverage and effectiveness of the investment in a shorter term. We'll need more time. We are having problems. We're increasing coverage. We're having spillover, that is mistakes on inclusion of certain groups. There's mistakes on inclusion. We still did not reach entire territories. So what we do, this is the big, what is very interesting on public policies is this. There is not a given answer. We need to take in account what you have available and do some choices. Therefore, the answer is it depends. That's not the answer, but it's the possible, is what we can answer. We have another question here. Which is a very technical one. That's also a matter of policies, which says that you showed very clearly that the income distribution, direct income distribution, through policies of income transfer, has its own limits, given by the degree of development of the country. The clearest example is the local labor market. And here the question is, why then the people in favor of a higher distribution and people in favor of more development, why don't they get together and understand each other? Well, there has been an amphibious class then, because I am a hybrid of both policies. When we conceive the policies, which demands must be answered to? We're asking for a more universal response, or within a more particular perspective of a given group of which focus upon them. Brazil and many other countries are very flexible. Brazil does not suffer much from the lack of theoretical framework. A policy which is focused to 50 million people is not a focus policy. And a universal policy that deals with 120, 130 million, and we can live along with that, in the case of education, is neither 100% universal. And why not? Because in actual fact, the country's historical construction has allowed for the policies to take place in this way. And in the case of health, there was already a reasonably well-developed healthcare market, at least in the main urban centers. Now the state bases itself upon what the pre-existing conditions and uses private agencies to accomplish this healthcare program. We did not formulate a universal system after the Second World War like in Europe. There was already a structure set up. The market was established. The state becomes only being a intermediate, and he purchases services among already existing service providers and the people who needed the service. And this progresses to a point where people say, no, the transition is not complete. I don't think so. I think that actually this transition took place in the conditions that the country was able to develop. Our model, we did not start from scratch like in Europe. Once again, I talk about the Brazilian social protection policies. Where there are public policies, there is a capacity of investment where the state is progressively persuaded upon reaching this question. So it's not that Brazil has chosen to be focal or universal, or that they have abandoned insertion in the labor market. Brazil does its choices of public policies considering what is feasible. That is, Brazil is a pragmatic country. That was in health and in social protection. If you tell me, oh no, but the theoretical model is not coherent. Sure, it is inconsistent, true. You're right. I suspect I know who did this question, but we live along with that. There's another question here about the matter of the changes on the postmodern well-being state, where one of the pillars of neoliberalism was exactly the reform of the social protection system, like social security and the system of privatization of the funds, social security. So a structural reformulation of the social security and the mandatory social security. And this is set up already. How to establish a dialogue regarding the new policies and the idea of social protection within this panorama, within this framework. Until 2 years ago, I used to think that the European crisis was going to produce an important contraction of the European protection social system. I used to think of the countries that want to do adjustments in their models for different reasons. They will take advantage of the crisis and do what Thatcher did not achieve, to start from scratch. I used to believe that. The problem is that the crisis is so deep and so lengthy that this will not be easy to achieve. even if there is a will, a historical will, to accomplish such adjustment, the situation of the European population at the moment is very, very poor. So this will not be easy to achieve. What is the responsibility we in South America have with that? We're in the opposite sense. We're expanding the rights of the population. Of course, this is not a movement. It's not a coherent trend. Let's see the example of Brazil, for instance. Brazil does not enhance only the rights. In the case of, in our case, we do also curtailment of rights. I will do a teasing here. I'm fully in favor of the limitation of social security rights. The state becomes more rational. But in any case, we are increasing the social entitlements. Entitlement for the extremely poor, entitlement for different brackets, entitlement for children. We're progressing on that. Because we're in a different moment, a different historical moment. We're in a moment of growth, but another moment of this story where we had the European experience, but not only European, the Canadian experience, which are references for us. We need to understand which is our peculiarities as far as social protection models. Why that? For the following reason. Countries that will face other growth waves, like in Africa, they will have their moments. Some of them are going through this already, like Angola, Mozambique, South Africa. They will need models which are closer to ours because they're more recent.
And because there are very speedy changes of development than the other processes in Europe and South of Asia. So we have responsibilities that are not really concerned to the Pacific Atlantic Ocean in Panama. Our responsibility to constitute models that will also be useful for other countries to rethink their own models. Some questions here arriving that are hearing us on internet, and one of them which is the effect on short term on universal social policies. The University of California studied a lot, and Bolsa Família also. There is an interesting relation between inclusion mistakes and defeat in municipality elections. This is very significant regarding this type of thing. They continue studying. What happens is the following. People think that social policies are political. There's a lot of lack of facts for this because, in fact, greater part of the population have an idea on the policies. They live political policies. For example, health, education, and now recently social assistance. People, they live them or they know someone has lived through them. And this understanding allows them to judge these policies and also compare them with the public managers. So it's not just anything. It's a public policy that has to be very consistent with the expectations the population has. Therefore, the best way to contribute with some expectation is this is not if you're a good manager and you perform a good public policy, you have to have a good social perception. And therefore, you have more opportunity to have a positive social perception. You have more chances. That doesn't guarantee anything. So this is an issue. But what I really saw many times, someone trying to start a political policy at the eve of political elections. From left, from the right, any kind of country. And I said, the times they asked me my opinion, I said, okay, do it, but poverty can't wait anymore. But I doubt that this will have any kind of impact on the elections. First, very simple reason, any political policy requires time to make mistakes. So these immediate motivations, they have to be understood. There's nothing wrong. Someone have an expectation when they implement these kind of policies to fight poverty and extreme poverty. Anyone that has this kind of agenda, they have my vote. The problem is to really do this, to implement, to continue, because they're very painful processes. In the case of universal experiences, they're market resistance. Market is a very bad enemy until they understand that the state is the mediator of the purchase, and then they start thinking. But until you reach this level of love, let's say, it takes time. In the case of social protection, considering social assistance, it's different because it's a policy for poor people, and then someone associates this immediately. They want to buy poor people. Obviously, no one says, they don't say someone wants to buy rich people when they have. No one wins an election promising. They have to really do things for rich people. So the issue, this is more complex. They're more complex because it depends on the effectiveness of public policy. So something that really always surprises me, at the beginning, the right had a lot of difficulty to work with protection policies, and then they started working in some countries with this, but it was necessary to have a sincere adhesion, because if not, the first difficulty, they just abandoned the program. I saw many governments on the year that is previous to the election, they remember that they didn't continue with the program. They want to re-continue, but this will not be convincing. It won't be convincing. You say it was a policy for social requirements. We're reaching the end because of limitation of time. We have two questions that I will make both at the same time, and then you answer them. For the first one is the use of technology, of IT and communication, and the ongoing of these policies as a transversal tool regarding the empowerment of these policies. This is one question. And the other one, if you could explain a little bit more what is the Center Rio+20 that you will become a director today of this Center Rio+20. Okay, the technology is an important issue because there is a change in the interpersonal relationships that technology is promoting. Politics is very far from this. It hasn't understood these tools. The public management has understood it very little. It has a little understanding, but very little. From the point of view of operations, there is a greater comprehension. For example, the payments of income transference in several countries, this will be made by cell phones. And this allows that the purchase of something in a shop will be made by cell phones. Notwithstanding the cash discount in the ATM. Now, we are investing a lot. We considering Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil's experience. In the Brazilian case, for example, it's an alternative. In Colombia, it is the alternative for some cities. So we already have a strong presence of technology in public policies operations. For example, medical appointments is also possible by text messages. However, having an increase of democracy through technology in the public management was still very far away. And it's very curious because some experiences of these experiences are from the 90s, for example, Bologna or Hyperbole, they were really searching this kind of model. So the fact is that the state in this, it has advanced in transparency because the collections are more available, but it hasn't advanced in the interaction of people for the debate of public policy. We are still owing regarding this. I think this is an issue that deserves a reflection and something to understand how the deepening of democracy can be made through technology, especially in the management of public policy. And just to close this subject, many countries have low participation of civil society in public policy. But Brazil, that is not the case because we have a great, huge experience, and as health is a paradigm for public policies, is something to be considered. Because as in fact, we're not proposing overlapping of the formal instances, but I'm saying how to increase the debate on public policies and to have competence for this within the health policy. Brazil obviously has a lot to be developed and has a lot to say on this. Not only Brazil, but also very well succeeded experiences in other countries. And I will mention once again the situation in Bogotá and in Peru as well. Debate with communities where Peru has a very good experience in this. The Center Rio Plus is a legacy of Rio Plus 20. When the conference ended last year, the countries committed themselves to constitute a center to promote debate, sustainable development, and Brazilian government and PNUD started investing to constitute this center. The center starts working today in Rio de Janeiro, and its effort to develop this debate, especially to make a list of what has been produced, not only in the private and public sector, in sustainable development, in this conceptual matrix of society, environmental economy, promote dialogues, debates between different sectors, once again, academic, public and private sectors, and also promote good experiences that are practiced in all these areas. Therefore, it's a center to sponsor debate and where we will work with all the matrix that deal with this subject. We have a first activity on the 13th of June, when we start the week of the environment. We will have in Jardim Botânico a debate together with the environmental ministry on sustainable development. And our emphasis will be on the contribution of South Hemisphere to this debate. The center is an international center where we will intend to make this exchange of South-South on this issue. On the 24th of June, we will have a debate here in Rio with the presence of economist Jeffrey Sachs and Malay Martikor, debating alternatives for sustainable development. It's a real debate with different ideas on the issue, trying to establish our footprint on this subject. And as I said, we will have other partners like COPI, where will be for the 2 next years. And we have 25 other partners from the public and private sector. And we hope that Isaac will join us in this network of partners. Okay. Thank you very much. I pass the floor to you if you want to give some final words regarding, and I thank you very much the participation of all of you. Everybody has enriched a lot this discussion. We have had more than 20 questions. Some of them, it was not possible to include all of them because of time, and I also thank everyone. I call Minister Temporão to close the session. Thank you very much. I would like to thank, in the name of ISAGS, the participation of Dr. Rômulo Paes de Sousa. Evidently, ISAGS publicly is aligned to the interesting space of discussion of sustainable development. All the interfaces for us from the health area are very strategic and important, and also to inform through the ones that are hearing us that this debate will continue until Wednesday here in ISAGS, approaching the 12 countries of South America, the health and social development areas, and all this material, the final product of this material, also the brilliant conference Dr. Romulo made today. This will be available on our web page and internet. And also to thank all the ones that participated on internet, sending suggestions, questions, and comments for this event to be so successful. And I myself was very stimulated, not only by Dr. Romulo's conference, but by the debate that pointed some issues of very great relevance and a rich material for us to really advance in the path of this discussion that we call of us, the critics of social determinants or of social determination of. Thank you, and thank you very much, and a good afternoon.